Hello everybody, welcome. In my last video I spoke of ideas from Owen Barfield's book, Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry. Today I'm going to try to expand on that a bit with a reading and some discussion of his idea that he refers to as original participation, something that is largely missing from most of our experience as moderns in highly representational contexts such as cities and the internet. Yesterday I introduced the concepts of figuration, which is essentially the act of recognition in consciousness of things, beings, situations, circumstances, properties, qualities, and so on, according to our collective representations that we acquire during the processes of enculturation and in languaging in childhood and throughout our lives. So figuration is then a sort of matching of terms to features of experience that is primarily representational. Alpha thinking is thinking about the relationships and the representations between the things that we have representations of, and this is the primary form of thinking that is done in scientific inquiry today. Beta thinking is thinking about that process and consciousness itself, the nature of minds, how we interact with the world through all of the different means that we have at our disposal, and the capacity to consider both the dangers and opportunities inherent in alpha thinking and figuration. Today, I'm going to go after a topic that is introduced early in the book, which he calls original participation, and shortens to participation for ease of reading. And he has the perspective, which I agree with, that archaic thought, the thought of our ancestors, and particularly before a certain point in time, but certainly before the time when hypotheses were understood to be true or false. Previous to that, he proposes that, for example, in Greece, the truth or falsity of a hypothesis was largely, not completely, irrelevant. What was important was whether or not we learned to see better, right? We gained insight through the introduction of a hypothesis, some kind of model or proposition about things, beings, situations, and particularly the sky. It turns out in his book, he introduces the idea that around the time of Galileo is when the shift from hypothesis as a useful method of seeing, so we could have 7 different hypotheses that directly conflict with each other, and we could hold them in our minds at the same time and get the benefits of each of them without being concerned about which one was right. And you will see in modern thought that there's a radical difference from this idea of hypothesis, particularly since the scientific revolution, in which we are concerned more about correctness, and this is relative to rectangles being right, the right hand, and so on. In effect, it's a new phase of the domination of alpha thinking-like processes and particular modes of concern and awareness that we associate with certain features of the left hemisphere, even though it is true for most of us while we are awake, both hemispheres are involved in most of the processes that we have, but their involvement differs dramatically from each other. So I'm going to begin now with some readings from the chapter, The Texture of Medieval Thought, and I hope to get at something resembling what original participation means, or what Barfield is meaning by it. Indeed, to understand how the word, quote, literal, unquote, has changed its meaning is to understand the heart of the matter. For our problem is, precisely, to transport ourselves into the interior of minds, for which the ordinary way of looking at and of thinking about phenomena was to look at and to think about them as appearances dash representations. He means something different by representation here than the ideas that I've been exploring recently. For which, therefore, knowledge was defined not as the devising of hypotheses, but as an act of union with the represented behind the representation. This is the idea that things, beings, and circumstances are hypostases, lesser but material forms of invisible processes in origin, or the divine world, or in God. And it is only by reconstructing in imagination, and not just in theory, the nature of the representations they confronted, that we can hope to really to understand the mode of their thinking. If we approach it from this end, instead of, as usual, by way of our own representations and our own consequent distortions of the then meanings of their terms, then the scholastic terminology does indeed spring to life for us. By scholastic, he means medieval, essentially. Form and matter, actus and potentia, species, essence, existence, the active and the passive intelligence, and the rest. We must forget all about our laws of nature, those interposed spectral hypotheses, before we can understand the forms of medieval scholasticism. For the forms determined the appearances, not as laws do, but rather as a soul determines a body. And indeed, the animal and human soul was defined as the form of the body. We must forget all about causality as we understand it if we want to understand how the form was also causa exemplaris. In essence, he means something like the physical expression of a transcendental causal situation. But there is not anything to forget, for we have not even a transmuted survival of that actus colon potentia polarity, which was the very lifeblood of scholastic thought, central in its heart and manifest through its capillaries at all points of its surface organism. Being is potential existence. Existence actualizes being. Yet, in the universe, actus precedes potentia, for out of potentiality a subject cannot be brought except by a being that is actual. The being of God is wholly actual and is at the same time his existence. But for creatures, it is only their existence which actualizes not their own being, but the being of God, which they participate, not in which they participate, which they participate. Everywhere around us, we must see creatures in a state of potentia being raised to actus, and yet, behind the appearances, the actus is already there. What is the intellectual soul but the potentiality of determining the species of things? And what are the phenomena themselves? Actually, the likenesses or representations of all sorts of species, but potentially, that is, in the condition described as in potentia, immaterial in the soul itself. Phenomena and mind in perpetual interplay, with species hovering somewhere between them as the moment in which the one becomes the other. anima enim quasi transformata est in rem per speciem, Latin. Knowledge for such a consciousness was conceived of as the perfection or completion of the naming process of thought. In ordinary thinking or speaking, as in perception, the perception was a half-conscious process, but knowledge was an actual union with the represented behind the representation. The knowledge of things that are is the things. This is all in quotes. Cognitio eorum qua sunt ie quae sunt est, wrote John Scotus Erigena in the 9th century, quoting Dionysius. Nothing, wrote Aquinas, is known except truth, which is the same as being. Nihil enim situr nisi verum quod cum ente convertitur. Or, as a mean between potentia and actus, it was the process of actualization of the soul's potentiality to become what it contemplated, and thus a stage on its journey back to God. God's own knowledge was alike the cause of all things and identical with his substance, and man participated in the being of God. Indeed, it was only by virtue of that participation that he could claim to have any being. Now, participation as an actual experience is only to be won for our islanded consciousness of today by special exertion. It is a matter not of theorizing, but of imagination, in the genial or creative sense of the word, and therefore our first glimpse of it is commonly an aesthetic experience of some sort derived from poetry or painting. And yet this experience, so foreign to our habit, is one which we positively must acquire and apply before we can hope to understand the thought of any philosopher earlier than the scientific revolution. Without it, we shall not really understand what they mean when they use the commonest terms, species and genus, form and matter, subject and accident, cause and effect. Instead, we shall clumsily substitute a meaning of our own. In the work of Thomas Aquinas in particular, the word participate or participation occurs almost on every page, and a whole book could be written, indeed one has been written, on the uses he makes of it. It is not a technical term of philosophy, and he is no more concerned to define it than a modern philosopher would be to define some such common tool of his thought as, say, the word compare. Only in one passage from the whole of his voluminous works, according to M. Geiger, did he feel it necessary to indicate his meaning, and this he did principally by illustrating it. Thus, after telling us that the species participates the genus and the accident the subject, that matter participates form and effect participates cause, he gives us a glimpse of what all these participations signify to him by adding, quote, "Suppose we say that air participates the light of the sun, because it does not receive it in that clarity in which it is in the sun. At one end of the scale, the subject participates its predicate, at the other, a formal or hierarchical participation, per similitudinem, was the foundation of the whole structure of the universe. For all creatures were in a greater or lesser degree images or representations or names of God, and their likeness or unlikeness did not merely measure, but was the nearer or more distant emanation of his being and goodness in them. It was a spiritual structure, and much of it lay beyond the world of appearance altogether. Angels, for example, are not simply the subject of a separate work, or a separate chapter in the Summa, but occur everywhere in it and are as likely to be referred to in a purely epistemological as in a cosmological context. It will be well to point out here that, if I have concentrated on one particular medieval philosopher rather than attempted a conspectus of the whole field of medieval philosophy or theories of knowledge, It is because that is the method which a history of consciousness, as distinct from a history of ideas, must adopt. It must attempt to penetrate into the very texture and activity of thought, rather than to collate conclusions. It is concerned semantically with the way in which words are used, rather than with the product of discourse. Expressed in terms of logic, his business is more with the proposition than with the syllogism, and more with the term than the proposition. Therefore, it must particularize. It must choose some one, or at best a few points, for its penetration. It is a question of making the best choice, and to me the best choice seemed to be the language and thought of Thomas Aquinas. I could probably have found more sensational illustrations of participation in, for example, Erigena or Albertus. For the Arabians, participation, with a particular intellectual emphasis, was so complete as practically to exclude individual human identity. I think, have found fewer illustrations among the nominalists, but they can be fairly regarded as forerunners of the scientific revolution, in whom the decline of participation cast its shadow before. Moreover, in the mind of Aquinas, with his enormous erudition, the whole corpus of medieval thought is in a manner recapitulated, and he is as sober as he is profound. I'm hoping that in recording my video, my setting the phone down on the table did not interfere with my voice reaching the microphone. Now, there are examples of phenomena in our modern experience that we can understand as being participated. Some of them are very simple, like the flavor of food, or a kiss, or lovemaking, or perhaps getting into a physical altercation. There are many other examples. However, what I want to point out is something radically different from these. It's also, at least modestly, true that under the influence of psychedelic drugs, we will begin to have experiences that at least resemble something like original participation. But the example I want to give today is one from about 20 or 22 years ago in my own life. And there's some backstory. So the backstory is that there was a really large paper wasp nest under one of the eaves on my back porch. And the landlord hired an exterminator to destroy it. The next year, at about the time when the wasp queens that have overwintered emerged, I encountered what I believe to be a wasp queen, and she was dying. Her wings were damaged. It appeared that she was poisoned, and I believed that it was possible that she escaped that nest. This was all post hoc. That she escaped the nest and overwintered, went into hibernation, but awoke poisoned and was dying. And I felt incredible compassion, wonder, and awe for this creature who I could not rescue. Now I'll mention that in Hymenoptera, and particularly in many wasp species, what happens is that a queen will found a nest, other possible queens will arrive, and they will engage in combat, and the winner of that combat determines whose eggs will be fertile. The eggs of the other queens in the nest are infertile and often serve as food for the young. The nest grows, becomes vast. There are perhaps 100 or more insects involved, but this process produces something like an evolutionary filter, right? The queens who win reproduce. as I was looking at this wasp and having these feelings of intense communion, if you will, with her, suddenly my mind and identity disappeared, and they were replaced with something like an epic history of the wasp people covering millions of years. And all of this was transmitted into my mind in a moment, in an instant. And it was if I was traversing the entire evolutionary history of the wasps as the spirit of the wasp people. Disasters in nature, epic battles, hives being obliterated by animals and other forces, an astonishing kind of awareness that nothing in my previous experience had ever resembled at all. It was as if I had become the spirit of the wasp people and their entire historical stories, and all of them, not one. This sounds impossible. The words that I'm making don't even make sense to my waking world modern consciousness. And yet I had this direct experience of something that I would call a transfer of the history of the wasp people, and perhaps this particular species of wasp. My consciousness became that history for a moment, an instant that seemed to have incredible extent, impossible extent, millions of years in an instant. And yet it was effortless, and I was helpless before it. As I came back to consciousness, I was absolutely overcome. It had never occurred to me that something like this was even possible. And I suspect that what Barfield would ask us to understand is that experiences like this were not only possible for our ancient ancestors, they were the bread and butter of their daily experience. And this sheds light on what happens in the evolution of human consciousness as these faculties begin to disappear during the onset of figuration and alpha thinking, which will eventually overcome them completely and set us in a world of dead knowledge, right? Tokens, tags, thoughts about this is a fork, the forks go in the drawer, I drive the car needs gas. Ridiculously unparticipated reference. Now, if we think carefully about this, it immediately two things become apparent. The first is that what we think of and ordinarily mean by the word knowledge is false, meaning knowledge as we usually understand and experience it is empty. There's no life in it. It's dead inside. It's almost similar to computation, right? And this is a catastrophic and devastating impoverishment for we moderns who live perhaps throughout our entire lives without a single experience of direct participation, or we have very few, or they're limited only to specific kinds of circumstances or behaviors, such as eating food, kissing, lovemaking, physical combat, and so on. If one is well read, one will necessarily encounter stories of experiences like the one that I have shared here. When I posted the other day on Facebook a post about the sort of paucity of our common experience, a woman named Iana Rachil made a brief post in which she described jumping into a river and then having the river jump into her, and in her consciousness she became the river and all of its experiences, its memories of the ancient world before the humans, its memories of the processes of being polluted and used as a product by humans and so on. And she was astonished that this was even possible, as was I. So I want us to understand by the idea of original participation something that has nothing to do with thinking about things. Something so astonishing, so holy, so sacred, so divine, that compared to it, the entirety of our experience of representational thought is empty, dead. And so in the Bible, it occurs to me that in Genesis, where God is talking about the trees in the garden and saying, do not eat of the tree of knowledge, for you will die, or it is death, this is partly what is meant. If we partake of the specific nectars, if you will, we will be transformed by them, and over time, and perhaps even immediately, we will lose original participation, and we will be trapped in the endless dead labyrinth of dead knowledge. In this sense, what we understand as knowledge is false. It's false to origin, right? To the direct experience of other beings, to becoming the experience and memory, and perhaps the entire history of a being or beings that we encounter, or a living place or situation, and so on. So I think I will draw this video to a close now. I hope that my reading came through. I'll have to check that when I'm done making the recording. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share with you something that I think is fundamentally crucial to our humanity, but which so few of us experience, and many of those who do experience it will not discuss it, because it should be obvious that original participation is anathema to our cultures and societies. It will be attacked as madness, confusion, delusion, dreaming, and so on, and dismissed. And we may also be attacked for presenting it. It will change the perception of our public persona so dramatically that in some cases we will not survive it, right? We may be institutionalized or incarcerated or attacked, or perhaps crucified. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning together again very soon. Bye-bye for now.